poll, throughout New Labour's time in power, a majority of people supported at least renationalisation of the railways, the privatised utilities and so on. But in terms of politics, it felt like we were the only people who ever argued for it. And we were told nationalisation is out of date, it's finished, you can't nationalise, it's out the arc. It's like going back to communism, equating it with what existed before 1989 in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Then, of course, capitalism went into crisis, and to rescue it, they were quite happy to nationalise things. And they have stepped in and nationalised huge swathes, in reality, of the banking system in Britain. Of course, it's not genuine socialist nationalisation. Northern Rock are still the first to repossess on the high street. They haven't changed their approach because they're formally being run by the government. The Royal Bank of Scotland gives big bonuses to its chiefs, and Darling says, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. It's taxpayers' money running that bank. What do you mean there's nothing you can do about it? But it's not genuine nationalisation. It's nationalisation to prop them up and to sell them back to the private sector at a future point. But nonetheless, it's reawakened a whole layer of people to the ideas of genuine nationalisation. After all, as we put forward, why couldn't the finance sector be nationalised? Not the horrific dictatorships that existed in the Soviet Union, not that kind of nationalisation, nor the capitalist nationalisation that the governments are carrying out now, but nationalisation where it's actually run by and for the majority of people, where you have elected representatives from the workforce, from the users of the banks, representatives from the national government as well, and you work out a plan to do things that people need. Interest-free loans for students, paid back, well we would say never actually, but paid back over a long period of time. Interest-free loans for other people who needed them. When people were faced with repossession, say no repossessions, we will not repossess you. Unless, of course, it's someone who owns 2 mansions, then you'd say, no, you've got to take a terraced house. But the basic idea that you wouldn't deprive people of a home, so why couldn't nationalisation take place on that kind of basis? That's what we're arguing for. And it doesn't just end with the finance sector. Nationalisation is starting to come up more broadly. For example, the recent struggle of the Vestas workers on the Isle of Wight, a wind turbine plant, clearly doing something useful, threatened with closure, the workers occupied it, and they demanded that it was nationalised. Anyone who thinks that workers couldn't run things themselves, I spent a bit of time down on the Isle of Wight, as I know other people in the room did, those workers knew everything about how to run that wind turbine plant. It was set up to produce blades for the American market. They knew exactly how to change it so it could produce blades for the British market instead, to change what it did and so on. And they understood that the best thing to do would be to nationalise it and to run it in order to carry out what is clearly socially useful production. Governments, who were embarrassed by the whole thing because of their empty threats of promises of green jobs, were not prepared to step in and nationalise. It would have taken a much bigger movement to succeed in winning that. It could have been won. But the reason is because they're terrified. You do it for them, the idea will spread. Every factory that's threatened with closure, why shouldn't that be nationalised as well? And come to that, as we would argue, why just take over the lame ducks? Why not take over the big companies that dominate the British economy, not every small business, but those big multinational companies, and run them in the interests of humanity? There's a lot of anniversaries this year, but one of the anniversaries that there is the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So there's going to be all kinds of stuff about that in the media in the coming months. The regimes that existed, although they were based on a planned economy, we would say bore no resemblance to genuine socialism. They were brutal dictatorships. But when they collapsed, capitalism went on a worldwide offensive for 20 years to say theirs is the only system, it's wonderful, the free market works, you're all going to have peace, plenty, prosperity, and so on. 20 years on, we can say definitively, we do not have any of those things. We have economic crisis, we have the occupation of Afghanistan, increased wars and instability around the world, and the case for genuine democratic socialism is once more on the rise, to put all the enormous science and technique that exists to use for the good of humanity rather than the profits of a few. At the moment in Britain, for example, despite the recession, we still have the longest working week of any of the countries of Western Europe. So you have almost 3 million people unemployed, and then you have other people slogging their guts out to stay alive. The capitalists have discovered the idea of a shorter working week. But what they mean by that is instead of sacking people in this factory, we'll put you all on a 10-hour week and you'll only get 10 hours pay. We say, why not implement a shorter working week for everybody, share out the work, but without loss of pay? In order to give people, you could easily implement a 30-hour week immediately and give people a decent wage in order to allow people to have time to see their families, enjoy life, take part in the running of society and so on. So that's some of the things that you could do if you began to build a socialist society, but under the unplanned nightmare of capitalism, we will never get any of that. For me, it's kind of a silly example in the way, but one of the things that sums it up is doing the Freshers' Fairs this year. I've talked to quite a few young people who are going to study maths and physics, and they don't know what they're going to do at the end of their courses. Because up until a year ago, you were pushed to go into maths and physics because you could make a fortune because they were the only people who knew how those computers that ran all the hedge funds and the futures and the finance system worked. And let's face it, as it turned out, even they didn't know how it worked. But what does that say about capitalism? That that's what you do with maths and physics degrees, rather than working out how the universe works for productive means, rather than developing environmentally friendly technology, etc., etc. But that's the nature of capitalism. And that's why we would encourage all of you to join in a fight alongside us, to stop the cuts that are coming, to fight to defend a decent health service, to fight for free education, but also to fight for a different society. My very last sentence is to say that in this introduction, even though I've probably gone over time, I've only given a very brief glimpse of socialist ideas. In the discussion tonight, I'm sure lots of other people will contribute other things. But I would really recommend to anybody who's here tonight, join the Socialist Party if you're convinced, but also come along to Socialism 2009. The leaflets are on your seats. At that, there's going to be a whole weekend of discussion, going into many more issues than we can talk about tonight. Joe Higgins, the MEP that I mentioned, is coming over to speak at the main rally on the Saturday night. So if you're interested, if you want to know more, make sure you don't leave it tonight, but you also come along to that weekend.